All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. In 2015, the New York Mets came out of nowhere to win the National League East, or pardon me, the National League pennant, and they appeared to be set to contend for the coming years due to the young arms that they had in their pitching staff. Now, the Mets franchise has always been known for its pitchers, with names such as Tom Seaver, Dwight Gooden, and David Cohn leading the way over the years. In 2015, it was Matt Harvey, the first rounder taken in 2010, who had the electric fastball as well as the bravado to captivate New York City. Then the bulk and power of Noah Syndergaard, who the Mets got in as a throw-in with the trade with the Toronto Blue Jays when they sent R.A. Dickey north of the border. Jacob DeGrom was the quiet guy with the long hair who didn't look the part, but had the fastball in his arsenal that could make the best major league hitters look foolish. Zach Wheeler was the guy that the Mets received when they traded Carlos Beltran to the San Francisco Giants, while Steven Matz was the homegrown kid from Long Island that was expected to round out this rotation. But as soon and as fast as the Mets' arms rose to stardom, they began to fall off of a cliff for different reasons. Harvey was never the same after game five in the 2015 World Series. You go back to that year, of course, Harvey was coming off of Tommy John. There was an innings restriction. The Mets went past it. And it's just one of those things, honestly, at the end of the day, he just was never the same. And you look at the 2016 season, whereas the Mets faithful loved Harvey, when he no longer was delivering like they expected him to, the Boo Birds began raining on him at City Field. The Mets brass then tried to convince him to take a demotion to the minors to work on his stuff. He refused. And with that said, it wasn't long before he was on his way out of New York City, and pretty soon baseball altogether, as he just retired officially earlier this year. Pretty soon, injuries would derail the once promising career of Syndergaard, who missed the entire 2020 season before returning just prior to the end of 21, only to leave New York unceremoniously to join the Los Angeles Angels. And since then, Syndergaard has bounced around pitching for both the Philadelphia Phillies and now the Los Angeles Dodgers. Um, and even in doing so, in my opinion, Syndergaard looks less like a starting pitcher and more like a reliever. You look at the oft injured Wheeler during his time with the Mets, as he missed both the 2015 and 2016 seasons. And after finally getting ahead of his control and command issues, he turned into an all star caliber pitcher, but for the Phillies. Matz was injured from the word go when the Mets drafted him in 2009. And after initially showing promise when he pitched for the Mets during the 2015 playoff run, he has fallen off of a cliff talent wise. First, the Mets traded him to the Blue Jays, and now with the St. Louis Cardinals this season, Matz is 0-6 with an ERA of 5.37 in 10 starts. And then there's the beloved DeGrom. And of course, we know how things have unraveled, unfortunately, for Jacob DeGrom this week. Like I said, he was, to me, the most unheralded member initially of this Mets Fab Five of their pitchers, but he would quickly develop rock star status, of course, which was highlighted by his 2018 season for the ages when he tallied an ERA of just 1.70. But like I've talked about it this week with DeGrom, he was unable to stay healthy over his last 3 years with the Mets. And after cashing in on that big deal over the offseason with the Texas Rangers, Tommy John appears to be on the radar for him. And honestly, at this point in the game, due to his age, he may never be the same pitcher again. Now, looking back on these 8 years ago or so, this was supposed to be the backbone of this franchise for years to come. And it wasn't a New York City media hype train because these guys were the real deal. But you ask yourselves, where did things go wrong? It's a lot of things that you could possibly talk about. Uh, some people have always felt the Mets ownership at the time, Fred and Jeff Wilpon, weren't the best people to run a franchise. You look at it, and if that was the case, maybe if they weren't running the franchise, maybe both Syndergaard and Wheeler would never have left in free agency, albeit things were a little bit different for Syndergaard because that was kind of that transition period when Steve Cohen was taking over, but Syndergaard just wasn't as receptive to it. But nonetheless, you wonder if things would have been different. The ego of Matt Harvey. I really feel that maybe he could have benefited from just taking that trip down to the minors to work on this stuff. And honestly, the Mets tried to work with him. It just wasn't. Everybody just wasn't on the same page. And before you know it, he found himself bouncing around places like Cincinnati, Baltimore, the Angels. Of course, a lot of stuff transpired since then for Harvey. And when it's all said and done, his MLB career is officially over. You look at Matz and the way he's pitching right now, it's very difficult to make a case for him. But then, of course, DeGrom looked like a lifer. And I talked about this before, and I'll continue to say it. Maybe Jacob DeGrom should have learned to be more of a pitcher than a thrower of the fastball. And I've talked about him just like I've talked about other guys in baseball. Everybody is not equipped physically to consistently hit 98, 99, 100, on the radar gun. And maybe DeGrom could have ticked it back a little bit and maybe things would have been different for him with the Mets. We don't know. But you just look at everything. I mean, honestly, and that's the big question, big word here, if things had worked out for the Mets at the time with their pitchers, we probably don't have a scenario where this team went out and got guys like Justin Verlander or Max Scherzer, because things were supposed to be set up. But unfortunately, especially due to the injuries, it didn't work out. And I mean, when you think about pitching, I think about the Braves of the 1990s, and that franchise was very fortunate at the time to have three of the better pitchers of all time, and Greg Maddux, Tom Glavine, and of course John Smoltz. And Smoltz was really the only guy, that really had the injury issue. And for me, in my opinion, a lot of that for Maddux and Glavine, number one, they were old school pitchers. Number two, these guys, they knew how to take care of their bodies. And number three, they didn't overthrow out there on the mound. Maddox and Glavine were consistently 90 or 92 for the most part. They knew how to locate, they knew how to change up pitches, whether it was sliders, change curveballs, or fastballs, you name it. But nonetheless, that's the name of the game. They knew how to pitch. But nonetheless, with the 2015 Mets, it's one of those where they were young, they were exciting. They had the ability to own New York City. They had the ability to have New York in their back pocket. And these were guys that simply weren't afraid of it. But unfortunately for them, it didn't work out. CJ, what's going on, my man? How you doing? I know that you're probably into the series, definitely into the series right now with the Mets and Braves. I'll definitely touch on that in a moment. It looks like it's 10-9 right now in the bottom of the eighth as the Braves look like they're trying to make a comeback here. One out, excuse me, and nobody on base. So let's see how the rest of that contest works out. But nonetheless, here, you know, the Mets getting back to their pitching throughout the years historically. There was, of course, the 60s. They had Tom Seaver, they had Nolan Ryan, they had Jerry Kuzman, albeit Nolan Ryan didn't become Nolan Ryan until the Mets traded him to the California Angels. And of course, the rest is history. You think about the 80s, the likes of Dwight Gooden, Ron Darling, David Cohn, so many others. And then the downside, when the Mets tried to turn things around, if you will, in the 90s with Generation K, and it just didn't work out with Bill Pulsifer, Paul Wilson, and Jason Isringhausen. And of course, Isringhausen made a name for himself as a reliever in other places, a la with Oakland and St. Louis. But nonetheless, tomorrow is never promise to anybody in sports. It's one of those you got to strike while the iron is hot, and if you have, and that window is only open for so long. And CJ, you're probably not going to like to hear what I got to say in regards to pitching right now, but you think about those Braves of the 1990s, and you think about the Braves of the early 2000s, and they had that bevy of Hall of Famers in their rotation. And, it's tough, even with that, to guarantee championships. I mean, let's be real. How many times did we see the Braves from the early 90s to the mid 2000s get to the postseason? And unfortunately, for the most part, come up short. 95 was their best year, obviously, when it all clicked and they beat Cleveland for the championship. But I mean, Atlanta, they looked like they had World Series teams, World Series championship teams, at least, on the bend. I really like their chances in 91. Um, 93, they ran into a very good Phillies team in the LCS. I thought in 96 they were going to beat the Yankees. I really did think that year, and there were several others, but I'm just using that as an example that it's never a guarantee. And it's crazy. It went from here to down here in a New York minute for those Mets teams. And honestly, not if you're just a Mets fan. If you're a baseball fan, period, it's one of those where you can only imagine what could have been. You think about the Oakland A's of the late 90s, early 2000s, Mark Mulder, Tim Hudson, Barry Zito. And these guys were quality frontline starters for them for years. Oakland never even sniffed a World Series. And of course, Barry Zito stayed there longer than Hudson and Mulder. Mulder left. He was never the same. Hudson, did, and I'm sure you're going to appreciate this, CJ. Mulder did have some good years in Atlanta with the Braves. And of course, we all know what happened with Barry Zito once he left the A's and went to the Giants. He just fell off a cliff completely. But it's never a guarantee. But at the end of the day, you just have to wonder what could have been for that, that version of the Mets with those arms that they had leading the way. But again, nothing is ever guaranteed in the world of sports. But CJ, since I got you here, and I want to touch on a couple of other baseball things while you're here. Um, you look at the Braves. They obviously they once again look like the team to beat in the NL East. The Miami Marlins. They're looking like they're showing some signs out there. They're making a push. But to me, I look at the National League West. One of the biggest surprises, obviously, is the Arizona Diamondbacks. Nobody really saw this coming from them. And you just look at what they're putting up right now, and they're showing that, hey, you know what, this may not be the year that the Dodgers win the West. And CJ's commenting, and he's saying, speaking of pitchers, what do you think of people that say Strider is already better than Max Fried? I think Max is better. Spencer has not even been a starter for a full season yet. I'll tell you like this. When it comes to Spencer Strider, I will say the sky is the limit because he came out like gangbusters last year, had a solid rookie campaign. And of course, you always want to see how a guy, regardless if he's a pitcher or an everyday player, is he able to avoid that dreaded sophomore jinx? And it looks like Spencer Strider has been able to do that. And I always say, when a guy is able to avoid the sophomore jinx, that shows you that he's the real deal. Because we've seen guys over the years in baseball, regardless if they're pitchers or hitters. They'll go out there, put up a solid rookie campaign, and once word is gotten out, or once people know what that guy can or cannot do, he takes a step back, and he might just be one of those Johnny come lately one hit wonders. That's not the case with Spencer Strider. You gotta like the way he pitches. You look at Max Fried, they both have different styles, but I think different styles are very good, especially when it comes to pitchers, because it's something where, you know what, it allows you to keep an opposing team off balance, especially, in a postseason series where, each out is so doggone important. All of those innings are so important where, you know what, you can't get hitters comfortable sitting looking for the same stuff from different pitchers. So I think that's a good problem to have if you're the Atlanta Braves. CJ, you're saying I think Max Fried is one of the most underrated players in recent history. Max is also well, I'll tell you like this. Winning makes people household names. And I think, the Braves winning the series a couple of years ago put them in a little bit of a different light there. It's one of those also being a consistent contender, puts them in a different light. I think for the Braves, obviously it was a shock to have them fall by the wayside so early last year in the postseason. But that's just the nature of the postseason beast, if you will. But I'll say like this: if the Braves, hypothetically speaking, can go out there and make another deep postseason run this October, I don't think that we're having the same conversation. I don't think a lot of people are having the same conversation about them because there's going to be more household names. You think about the Los Angeles Dodgers. Obviously, Dodgers won that championship in 2020. Obviously, Dodgers, for the most part, have made the playoffs every year for the last 10 years. But nonetheless, and obviously, a bigger market in Los Angeles, but still, there's household names because people are accustomed to seeing them. The same thing can be said with the Houston Astros, and I think them coming back and winning that second championship last year, as well as being in the World Series the year before, has kind of given them household names. And of course, obviously, there are household names for other reasons with the whole quote unquote sign stealing scandal. But nonetheless, if the Braves go out there and have themselves a deep postseason run and probably end up in the World Series, we're probably not having this conversation. Last year, I'll tell you like this with the Braves, they ran into a hot Philadelphia team, and I say hot because to me, Philly, after probably like that seventh or eighth inning in game one of the wild card round against St. Louis, Philly just figured it out and they just rode that wave of momentum to the pennant. And I think if you go back to that series against the Braves and the LDS, the Phillies picked the perfect time to play their best baseball while the Braves picked their worst. And even in that, I think it was game one of that series, Atlanta jumped out and then Philadelphia came back, chipped away, and that was it. And they never looked back. And that's what it's all about. When you get Uncle Mo on your side in those short playoff series, anything can happen. Just getting back to the subject where I started with the 2015 Mets, you go back and you look at that Mets team from that year. They were about a 500 team for the entire season until they made that trade just prior to the deadline to acquire Yoenis Cespedes. And then they had the series right after that with the Washington Nationals, a team I think the Nats were 2 games ahead of the Mets in the standings at the time. The Mets swept that series. Of course, I think it was like 3 or 4 home runs they hit on that Sunday night game, and the Mets never looked back. And then once they got to the postseason, of course, the rest is history as they won that pennant. And unfortunately for their sake, they came up short in the Fall Classic. Let's see. You're saying, but do you are with Max Fried being underrated? I'm not going to say he's underrated. And the reason I'm probably the wrong person to ask that question to, only for the simple fact that if I was a casual fan, maybe fine. I might not pay attention to him, but to be into the fact that I'm a guy who pays attention to it and to baseball like that, it's one of those for me that all right, I'm not, I know what he can do, and I know what he can't do. It's kind of like, in basketball. I know, CJ, you don't follow basketball as much, but I'll use this example. I've been following Nikola Jokic for several years with the Denver Nuggets. So I know what he can and cannot do. It could have been easy, you know, for me to be like, hey, why aren't you guys watching them? Because the casual fan might have not paid attention to him. But of course, now that he and the Denver Nuggets are in the NBA Finals, of course, now he's become a household name. It's all good, CJ. You know what? It's one of those where let's see what that score is right now for you. All right, so it's 10-9, uh, 2 on, 1 out for the Mets in the top of the ninth. So let's see what happens with that. But nonetheless, getting back to the premise of where I started with, regardless if it's a 2015 Mets, 90s Braves, 80s A's who made it to 3 consecutive World Series, nothing is ever guaranteed. You can't say, you know what, we'll figure it out. You got an opportunity to seize that moment. You got to seize it. And, unfortunately, for the Mets of that era, it was one of those scenarios where, hey, things broke for them, but things didn't break for them. And, if you're a fan of that team, you'd always have to sit back and wonder simply what could have been. So, folks, that's going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take this time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you have not already, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Now, if you're on Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it'll be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365. Now you can check it out. Drop a line and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. CJ, as always, it was a pleasure. Thanks for chiming in. I'll let you get back to your game. I don't know who the Braves play this weekend. I haven't checked the schedule as of yet. But nonetheless, regardless of what happens tonight, I'm sure you have to be pleased with them taking at least 2 out of 3 from this series with the Mets. And now, all right, you're chiming in that the Braves are going to be playing the Nats, a last place team, a young team though, that's trying to figure it out for themselves. But nonetheless, if you're the Braves, you definitely want to keep your momentum going. But nonetheless, this is William Martin signing off and saying thanks again for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. Be well, everybody.